Bon, pendant que les panélistes arrivent, je vais vous dire quelques mots. Je suis, comme Roland a dit, le président du Conseil international du Canada ici à Ottawa. Et nous sommes ravis de parrainer cette panel maintenant. I also want to take this opportunity to thank, as from our perspective, the CIC in Ottawa, our essential partners with the CIC headquarters, Jennifer Jeffs, Taylor Owen, who've organized this event, and we've been so pleased to dovetail in behind your efforts. And also to SIPS and Roland Paris and the SIPS staff that we are used to working with. We have 8 teams of organizers doing different events with the Canadian National Council in Ottawa. So it means we have as many as 3 events a week. So we're very used to working with Roland. In fact, we've had him at events where he has been on CPAC. And many of the young people here today are also working on our Politics in the Pub program. So we have a wonderful overlap, and we're just thrilled to dovetail in behind you today. This panel on diplomatic perspectives we were thrilled to sponsor. Diplomats are important members of the CIC in Ottawa and make a huge and ongoing contribution. Thank you.
Thanks, and thank you everyone for being here. My name is Kim Mackrael. I'm a reporter with the Globe and Mail's Parliamentary Bureau. This morning's session will deal with Canada's strategic challenges in global affairs, and we'll take a forward-looking approach. So what are the biggest challenges going forward? It's an opportunity to step back and consider some of the big questions about Canada's role in a world that is changing rapidly. I'm sure we'll touch on some of the points that Hugh Segal just made. We have some very eminent panelists with us today, and I'm going to take a moment to give you a quick, introduction so that you know who you're seeing. To my right is Paul Heinbecker. He directs the Laurier Centre for Global Relations, and he's a distinguished fellow in international relations at the Centre for International Governance Institutions. He's also previously served as Canada's ambassador to Germany and the United Nations. He's also a chief foreign policy advisor to former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. Rob Wright, who is beside Mr. Heinbecker, is a former Deputy Minister of International Trade. He was appointed as Canada's ambassador to Japan in 2001 and served as Canada's ambassador to China from 2005 to 2009. We have Joe Clark, former Prime Minister, with us. He has served as Canada's Secretary of State for External Affairs in the Mulroney government. And he's also the author of a book that was published last year called How We Lead, Canada in a Century of Change. And at the other end of the panel here, we have Louise Fréchette. She's chair of the board of the directors for CARE Canada. She's also a former Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations and has served as Canada's representative to the UN and ambassador to Argentina. I'd like to start off with a question that I would like to ask each of you to handle separately, and we'll try and have some opportunity to engage in the things that each of you are saying. So if you'd like to jump in, please feel free. The key question I'd like us to address to begin with is going forward, and I'm going to ask you to pick just one when you answer this. What is Canada's biggest strategic foreign policy challenge? And if we could start with Louise Fréchette.
Thank you very much. This is the kind of question that's really difficult to answer after listening for 15 minutes to a very rich and complex description of all these challenges are. So to pick one is a bit of an unfair question. But inspired by what I'm going through right now with CARE Canada and CARE International, and my experience at the UN Secretariat, I would say that a key challenge for Canada is to figure out how to manage our relations with a rapidly changing global South. This relationship has been defined for a long time by essentially an aid relationship for a good part of the South this relationship is changing extremely rapidly. Countries that used to be recipient of aid from the North are fading out of that universe, and those that are still in need of that kind of assistance, many of them now have a lot of domestic capacity, and therefore how do we relate to countries no longer as a recipient of our benevolence, because I'm afraid that's the way we have looked at the Global South for a long time, but as partners in promoting our shared values. The world, I don't think, will be necessarily organized around the three poles. I'm sorry, Senator, but I think there's a great mass of countries that will not adhere to one of those poles and are, in a sense, up for grabs in terms of the kind of world we want to promote. We have to relate better to the countries in the South, and I think it's a big challenge for NGOs as well. It's not only governments that have to recognize this change. Civil society organizations are quickly coming to the realization that their traditional business model is not going to be appropriate, and they have to adapt to a different kind of relationship. So that's really a big challenge, not necessarily the only one, but to me, where I sit now, it's a very big one.
Thanks very much. Mr. Clark, can I ask you to take that question on Canada's biggest or one of the biggest strategic challenges going forward?
There's a strong sense in which I agree with Louise, but I think that the first challenge in any significant strategic review is for Canada to develop a contemporary assessment of what our real assets are in this modern world. And I think that for a long time, we have assumed that they are a classical defense of interests, because that is what foreign policy is supposed to be, a fairly singular pursuit of interest. Canada, I would argue, grew up in an age, came to maturity in an age that was really much more multilateral than it was bilateral or seeking a particular nation's interest in a singular sense. And we have been framed by that multilateral aspect and should be pursuing that. What are those assets? I'm going to use phrases of which some people disapprove, and those are the phrase of soft power and of hard power. For a long time, we have assumed that our principal assets, those that could apply internationally, were economic and were military. And no one would dispute the importance of those. But there's no question that our emphasis upon so-called soft power assets has declined sharply in recent years at precisely the time when their relevance, not least with the Global South, is becoming more and more important. And I think that we have to recognize, among other things, and this came up in those portions of the conference I was able to listen to yesterday, there is an immense human advantage, an advantage among our citizens, among our non-governmental organizations, many of whom are very worldly in their knowledge and in their interests, but we have not yet found a satisfactory way to mobilize that significant Canadian asset in a way to pursue Canadian goals or Canadian roles. That's not only a question of a wasting asset. That means that we are not taking advantage of a potential constituency for change by any government that was inclined to change in the country. These are people who could be activists in advocacy as well as in the field, and yet I don't think we are paying enough attention to them. I think the question of multilateralism, which is a defining Canadian capacity, is one that we have let atrophy. With respect to the United Nations, that most imperfect of organizations, what we should be doing is not leading the chorus of attack, identifying its weaknesses. What we should be doing is leading the very constructive examination of its strengths now and the things that it could do later on in the world. I think, is an area where Canada would have a very significant voice and influence. I think this question to which Louise referred is, again, something where Canada has an unusual capacity to be effective. We're one of the few countries in the long-time G7, now G8, that has been a member both of the Club of the West with links to the much broader world. And again, there is a risk that we will allow those links to that much broader world to atrophy at a time when the countries who are members of that wider world are themselves becoming both more influential and more supple in terms of looking for alliances and cooperation that we should be proceeding. So that are necessary to where we might go. So I think that before Canada embarks too far along the description of our strategy in conventional terms, we need to take a look at the real world, not only as it is externally, but the real assets that we possess within our own country, and determine what it is we should do about that and how we might move forward.
Thanks. And Rob Wright, can you tackle that question, one of the biggest or the biggest strategic challenges going forward?
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. You can hear? Okay. Well, thank you, Kim. You said one, but you also alerted us in advance you'd asked this question, so I have three. I'm only going to talk about one, though, but I'll put the three of them out because I think they're relevant. And in fact, Louise and Joe Clark have already referred to one of them at least. We're middle power. How do we maximize that influence? How do we ensure that as a middle power going forward, we can still play a constructive role in the world? That would be one question, and it's alluded to both by Louise and by Joe Clark. Secondly, and I think it's important that we talk about this at some point, and that is immigration, global movement of populations. I think this is a key issue for us to understand and to participate in as a country that was founded on immigration. And I think it's one that is raising the temperature in a number of countries around the world, and we have to understand what's going on. But the third one, and the one I'll mention in more specifics, is, of course, our focus on the Pacific. China is the second biggest economy in the world in nominal terms, and soon will be the largest economy in the world. Japan is the third largest economy in the world. They're also our second and third largest trading partners, two-way trading partners, and they're going to stay our second and third largest trading partners in years to come. We need a more coherent, balanced, and consistent approach to our relations with the countries in the North Pacific. These relations shouldn't be driven by individual problems, specific issues that rise. It should be a nonpartisan commitment to stay engaged, excuse me, and to try to find ways and means to ensure that that dialogue is continued despite the ups and downs. I think this is something that needs to be led by the national government in Canada, but I think it's something where the private sector and the provinces have a very important role to play. So I'd like to see a national dialogue, much as we had in the 1960s and again in the 1980s about Canada-US relations. I'd like to see the same kind of discussion on Canada's role in the Pacific and how we're going to maximize our influence in that region in the future.
Thanks. Thanks for sharing the mic.
Same
Paul Heinbecker, same question to you. Yes, biggest strategic challenge going forward.
This is as someone once said, this is at the time, like at the UN. We're at the point where everybody has said something, but not everybody has said, has said it yet. So I will. Everything has been said, but it hasn't yet been said by everybody. That's what I meant to say. I think the biggest challenge is essentially governance. Are we going to be governed by power, or are we going to be governed by rules? Is it going to be rule of law, or is it going to be the law of the jungle? And I think the jury is out on that. When I see how the Russians have been behaving, perhaps their appetite is satisfied with Crimea. Perhaps they're not willing to go any further. That would be very good news. The Chinese behavior in the South China Sea is getting increasingly muscular. Does that mean that that they were only going to sort of live by the UN Charter so long as it was convenient to live by the UN Charter, and when it became possible to do otherwise, they weren't going to do it? I think we're looking at very big and very difficult, complex problems in international finance, in internet governance. Mark Raymond's terrific paper, I don't know where Mark is, he's here somewhere today. His terrific paper outlines just how difficult that is to have a multi-stakeholder approach to governance. We all, everybody wants to have a free and open internet. We don't want government control. We want the freedom of speech, freedom of access. But unfortunately, we don't all want the same thing, and we can't all have the same thing. And we have to do it in an atmosphere in which the National Security Administration and all the other spy agencies, including our own, have basically drained whatever trust there was in the international system, drained it out. Climate change is a very complex problem. I was the negotiator of Kyoto, I will admit, and we did have an idea how we would implement it, although that we're sometimes accused of not having it. It had something to do with a carbon tax, as we were talking about yesterday. But we didn't underestimate the difficulty of getting governments to agree to it. But it really was the only way we were ever going to make those commitments. So very, very complex governance issues are out there, and they are going to take innovation. I thought, and still think, that the G20 was the biggest piece of innovation in the last 20 or 25 years. It did save us from perdition in 2008, 2009, 2010, but it hasn't yet found the means to prevent us from going back into some other kind of crisis. So the biggest challenge to my mind is governance, and in that I think we have to start with the UN. The UN is necessary but not sufficient, I would say. But we should be very careful about one of the most I would say unhelpful statements on this score was talking about we're not interested anymore in reforming the UN. We'll let the reform take care of itself. Well, actually, reform, as anybody knows, in any government institution rarely takes care of itself and is really very important. But at the same time, all of the deprecation you hear about the UN leaves out the value of the Charter. The Charter are the rules of the road. The Charter has stigmatized aggression. That's part of the reason, probably, why Putin hasn't gone further. I mean, why would he have stopped otherwise? If we deprecate the Charter, if we don't take into account the hundreds of treaties which have been negotiated under UN auspices on climate change, on environment, on terrorism, on human rights, on nuclear weapons, if we just talk about ignoring all of that while we pursue our interests in the Gulf, I think we're making a very large mistake. That doesn't mean that it's enough to deal with the UN. And it's not a question of looking backwards at a time when we need to be looking forwards. There are enormous governance challenges, and those have to be addressed. But that's where we have had, as I think Huey said, a comparative advantage. We're good at this kind of stuff, of bringing people together, of dealing with diversity, of trying to find constructive outcomes out of disparate interests. That's a natural role for us. In a multipolar world, diplomacy is going to be more important than ever. And diplomacy is going to include more than just diplomats, obviously. I don't mean that in a narrow sense. But diplomacy is going to really matter. And I'm afraid we're not equipping ourselves. And we're basically Joe Clark called it as a kind of we're letting our relationships atrophy. I think that that's the case, and I think it's a mistake, and I don't think it has to be that way. So I guess my argument is that the most important issue we face is global governance. How are we going to, whether we're going to live in the kind of world that where we can live in peace and security, and it sounds trite, but it isn't trite if you're living in Ukraine right now, or Syria, and how we're going to look after crises like Syria. Human security, human-centered security is an idea whose time has come and gone. But the people who are paying the price for it are the Syrians, of whom we have taken, is it correct to say, 9 refugees? I think that's right, 9. That's what Chris Alexander said about a month or so ago. I know there's plans to take a few more. That's 100,000 times fewer than Turkey has taken. Thanks.
Thanks for that. I think this is actually a good opportunity to bring Louise back into this conversation on the topic of engagement with the United Nations, which Paul was speaking about. Could you address the question of, to what extent at this point and going forward is the United Nations a useful forum for Canada to be engaging in, and should Canada be pushing for reform or disengaging?
Well, first of all, I want to echo what Paul has said about the central role of the UN in being the maker and the protector of the international norms. And I don't think we appreciate how important and how useful these norms have been to pursue our own values and our own interests. The international system that was built around the UN after the Second World War reflected, by and large, the views of the victors, and the victors were the West. And to this day, the framework, the very big and complex network of international norms have been heavily influenced by us, the West, us, the richest part of the world and the more powerful part of the world. This is what I think is at stake in the future, and that's why I want to connect what Paul has said to what I identified as a big concern for me. Because I think right now we are in a state of transition, a state of flux, where you have more and more countries that are able to determine their own position. They're able to determine their own views, and will not be easily be bought by aid or threat or whatever. If we want to protect the set of norms that frankly reflect very much who we are, and if we want to ensure that the new challenges are answered by norms that continue to reflect our own values, then I think we must engage in the global forum. And the UN is imperfect, just like the world is imperfect. You can't change the world. You have to take it as it is, and that's what you find in the world. When the world can agree on something, then you can make progress. There has been enormous change in the UN in the last 20 years. People tend to focus on the reform of the Security Council as the measure of whether or not the institution is evolving. I think it's a huge mistake. Everything else has changed in the UN, including important norms like the responsibility to protect. What is happening through the UN and through various institutions in terms of defense and promotion of human rights was unheard of before the end of the Cold War. So it is an institution that is alive, that changes with time, where we have a role to play. And my hope that we will continue to be an active player in the UN is not because we were big stars in the past. That's quite irrelevant. And it's not because we were admired for our role. I think too much of the defense of multilateral and the UN is based on nostalgia. I hope that we retire forever the terms Pearsonian diplomacy. That's not what I'm about. But I continue to believe that a rules-based international system is in our best interest, and that multilateral institutions, starting with the UN, and including many other institutions, is the best way for us to protect and promote these interests and values that we hold so dear. Thank you.
Rob, if I could ask for your perspective on this. I'm curious, when you speak about the importance of engaging the Pacific and working with China, with Japan, To what extent is that possible in a multilateral setting, and to what extent is it important to have bilateral relations with those countries?
Well, the easy answer is both, of course. I think the Chinese are very comfortable in their role in the United Nations. They, of course, are a member of the P5. They have a veto. And they're willing to use it in order to pursue what they consider to be core Chinese interests. The Japanese have long been one of the major contributors to the United Nations, and still see it as a very important forum, but I think have always felt and continue to feel that their role is undervalued in the multilateral system. A subset to this, though, is the World Trade Organization and the GATT. Both countries, of course, both Japan and China are now members of that important institution. And this is a point, I think, that reinforces the point that Louise and others have made. The rules that were negotiated in 1947 to 1949 in the GATT, and which have now been translated into the World Trade Organization, are the rules that are still in effect today. And even with the negotiation of bilateral trade agreements, which have had a lot of attention and should continue to have a lot of attention, it's basically an extension of the rules that were established in the early 1950s under the GATT that have been developed and expanded into these FTAs. It's interesting, and just on the trade account for a moment, that both China and Japan now see the extension of bilateral and plurilateral trade agreements as a way to exert their authority within the regions. China is using their free trade agreements. They have one with New Zealand. They're negotiating with developing countries and developed countries. We've been thinking about the possibility of negotiating an enhanced trade agreement with China. They see that as a way of extending their influence within the region in particular. And the Chinese in particular, are not afraid of increased competition in the Chinese market from Canadian exports or other countries' exports. I think the rest of the world is more concerned about what increased liberalization, bilateral or plurilateral, with the Chinese will mean in terms of Chinese competition in our domestic markets. The Japanese, of course, it's a different issue. They have long had a protectionist lobby that has been very successful in resisting real liberalization of the Japanese market. But even in Japan, there is a move under Prime Minister Abe, so-called Abenomics. The third arrow of his reforms relates to structural change, and even there, the Chinese are looking at the possibility of real structural reform, allowing for more exports to come to the Japanese market, particularly in protected sectors. And if that's true, if they do move in that direction, that'll be a very important step, and one that we should be part of. We should certainly be looking at the Japanese market as well as the Chinese market, and watching closely what those countries do in terms of their new trade arrangements within the Pacific region.
You mentioned that that China is not afraid of imports and domestic competition on that front, but perhaps the rest of the world, perhaps Canada, is afraid of that. To what extent do Canada's concerns about security play a role in addition to that cybersecurity?
Well, I think certainly it's a dimension, and certainly it's one that is being discussed very broadly these days with all the revelations about Chinese cybersecurity and American cyber security and what have you. So I think it's relevant. But and to be honest, everybody is a practitioner in this business of listening to everybody else. So I'm not excusing anybody, and I'm not blaming anybody in this exercise. It's a fact of today's world that this information travels quickly and can be intercepted and interpreted. Having said that, though, I think it's a mistake for us, because of concerns we may have with one country or another country, not to take a step back and look at where Canada's core interests are served. And if our core interests are served in being at the table with the Chinese, or even with the Russians, certainly with the Japanese and others in the Pacific region, then I think it behooves us to have a policy in place that allows those discussions to go forward. As I said in my first comments, it's very important that we develop a national consensus on the importance of the North Pacific, and in particular China, to Canada's future interests and develop a policy that will allow us to continue a constructive dialogue. Doesn't mean we can't criticize those countries. Doesn't mean we have to agree with them on issues going forward. But it does mean that if we want to have some influence in the discussion, we should be at the table. And I fear that at the moment, we've reduced our capacity to influence the evolution of policy in the North Pacific, particularly in the Chinese market.
Joe Clark, with respect to what Rob was saying there, do you see a role for, I know you spoke about soft power being something that Canada perhaps needs to use some more influence on, to put some more focus on. Is there a role for Canada to take a bigger role in exerting its soft power to engage with Asia?
One of our challenges in engaging with Asia is that we have never had the kind of profile there that we have had in other parts of the world, whether it was Europe or for other reasons, Africa, or indeed for geographic reasons, the hemisphere where we live. And that has always been a disadvantage for us. I mentioned the other night that as foreign minister, the one part of the world where I had the most difficulty identifying how Canada would be seen, how we were different, was in Asia, because we didn't have the range of history and establishments there. Absolutely necessary that we be present at the table. Presence is one thing, another thing is influence. That's why I come back to this question of what are the Canadian assets that we bring. One of our assets, which I think, again, is atrophying sounds like a natural phrase. I think it is being deliberately ignored today, is our ability to deal with the widest range in the world. We have had that capacity for a long time. It was one of the assets of a diplomacy to which I will not give a name, Louise, out of deference to your sensitivities, but it did not belong exclusively to one party or one person. And it is essential because it is a card that is stronger for us than it is for most countries, and it is necessary. Let's take the question of Chinese treatment of the Chinese activity in international investments in not Canada, but in Africa or in the Americas, where there are very significant problems about whether they will be bound by some of the explicit and implicit conditions that apply to others. One way to achieve that is multilaterally. One way to achieve that is to encourage China, which is more and more interested in becoming, at least nominally, a part of the architecture of the world, to become an architect there. And if Canada has developed good bilateral relations, and if Canada has revived our reputation for the strong soft power attribute of being an effective multilateralist, we then could play a very significant role there. We have to bear in mind that what we do in the world is not determined entirely by our wish or by our desire. We have to deal with the reputation that we had, the reputation that we have, the assets that we have, the competition that we're facing, the appreciation of us or the disappreciation of us that exists in other countries. And that is one of the reasons that I think that while no one wants to be accused of nostalgia or caught in old views, I think that some of those attributes for which Canada is celebrated are more relevant now than they have ever been before, but they will grow less and less relevant if we apply them less rigorously.
Well, I want to put a question to Paul Heinbecker on something that was raised in Senator Siegel's speech this morning, and that's regarding the question of a reemergence of spheres of influence. Are we seeing something like that today? And if we are, what does that mean for Canada?
I don't think we know what we're seeing exactly today. It reminds me of there's a kind of litany you can go through. 1904 was the height of the British Empire. 1914 was the beginning of the end of it. 1924, the British went into terrible recession. Never really recovered their financial position. 1930 something, we were in the depths of depression. 1945 was the beginning of the nuclear age. 1956 was Hungary. 1968 was Czechoslovakia and the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And you can go on through a whole list of things, almost none of which were predictable. So if you're looking at, want a greater degree of certainty about what's coming, I think you just can't have that. It does say that the way you should respond to that is to look to your assets, as Joe Clark has said. You have to be true to your values and be prepared for a different kind of world, because what's coming next? I mean, the internet age is born effectively in the 90s and has transformed everything. No one foresaw that coming. So the idea is that you have to have a policy that is flexible, adaptable, which has some core assets, and you have to be ready to change quickly. I just want to say a word or two about middle power and soft power. Canada's not a middle power. Some of you have heard me in this, and I apologize to those who have. But in 1945, there were 51 members of the UN, and we were a middle power then. So now it's 2014, and there's 194 members of the UN. A middle power is El Salvador. Canada is not in the middle. Canada is one of the most effective countries on the planet. All we have to do, actually, is believe in ourselves. I don't think that there's a sufficient belief. There's a kind of refrain we've heard, and indeed we've even heard it from successive governments, which is, little Canada, what can we do? Well, we can do plenty. There's a country with the education system we have, with the economy we have, with the connections we have, with the markets we have. We have a lot more usable influence than a country with 600 million subsistence farmers. So we're selling ourselves short. We're not taking advantage of the capacity we have to shape international affairs so that they actually serve our interests rather than defeat our interests. And soft power, it always produces a giggle in the room when we talk about soft power. Soft power the concept is invented, this room would probably know, but there may be people who don't, was invented by Joe Nye. He was talking about the U.S. He was Assistant Secretary of Defense at the time, and he was talking about soft power as a way that you get people to do what you want by co-opting them rather than coercing them. We have plenty of soft power assets. When I was at the UN, I always got a respectful hearing, not because necessarily of our policies, although we had a reputation for being constructive and trying to advance matters, and being very active on questions like the environment. But it was about who we were. We were the country that integrated difference and diversity better than anybody else did. We were the country that, with the exception of our Aboriginal populations, it must be said, protected the rights of minorities better than anybody else did. When we spoke, people wanted to hear what we said. That's not an asset that you should give up readily, and you shouldn't deprecate it. Our foreign policy seems to have gone from Pearson internationalism to neocon militarism to neocon commercialism, and all of the time we seem to be avoiding having a foreign policy that actually works.
Seeing some nodding over there. Do any of the three of you disagree with the idea that Canada either is not a middle power or that we don't have soft power?
I don't disagree, but just one point of clarification, if I could, without wanting to focus too much on China. I think there's a risk of exaggerating the degree to which we may have lost influence, or the degree to which our reputation may have changed in the last 5 or 6 years. You read about this all the time, the fact that Canada was once welcomed and is now less welcome. I don't personally see that. I think most countries see this as an evolution of a political cycle, and that Canada's role as a constructive, I'll use the term middle power, Paul, a constructive middle power with a balanced view of the key issues facing the world is still out there. I use the example when I speak about this of China again. When I was in China, we were going through a difficult time in the management of our relationship with China. The new government, as it then was in Ottawa, was trying to understand China better and was clearly on a learning curve. And it set back our relationships in certain areas. And there's no question that we lost some influence in our ability to be able to talk to the Chinese. Doesn't mean that we could change what China is doing. China will follow its own course. But they were listening to us and interested in our ideas. But the Chinese foreign minister said to me on more than one occasion, look, we have the medium to longer term view. We know who Canadians are. We know that we have a close relationship across the North Pacific. We know that there's 1.3 million Chinese Canadians in Canada, and that there's something like 250,000 Canadian citizens living in Hong Kong with dual citizenship. So the Canada-China relationship will stay strong into the future. It'll go up, it'll go down, we'll face some of these bilateral issues, but the important thing that we have to remember is that we stay engaged, we stay talking, that diplomacy continues to do its job in ensuring that the ideas, the problems that we have, don't turn into issues that derail the long-term management and growth of the relationship. So I'm not as pessimistic as some commentators might be that Canada's international reputation has been tarnished, or that our role that we've played traditionally, and I think we'll play again in the future, has somehow been impaired.
Louise, do other countries take a long view on that relationship?
I think they do. They probably do. But where I have a little difficulty with the conversation of the last 5 minutes is that it perhaps doesn't recognize sufficiently that the field of upper tier countries is getting a lot more crowded than it was 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, where we were part of a fairly small club and we could shine. We will have to try harder to maintain that place, because there are more and more players that will want a seat at the table. And if we want to maintain our place at the table, we will no longer have an automatic place because of the size of our economy, because there are a lot of economies out there that are getting bigger than ours. So the challenge for us is not just to get back to where we were a few years ago, because the planet is changing very fast. Second point I want to make on that is that to be effective in multilateral institutions, you have to have very healthy, active, and productive bilateral networks. It's not an either-or, and those of us, and I think we're all pretty convinced that we need solid international institutions and to continue to build global norms. But in order to achieve our goals, we need to have a very rich network of bilateral relationships. And I'm sorry to say, we seem to be in the process of moving from an aid-focused relationship with the South to a trade focus. There used to be aid recipients, now they're markets. But there's more than that to building productive relationships with countries, and we should look. Of course, we cannot have a foreign policy that will have us reach out to every country on earth. We will have to choose where we invest our time and energies, but I think we should think a bit outside of the traditional regrouping. Yes, the Commonwealth, yes, the Francophonie, but they're not necessarily the best way to build relationships to the countries that count in the various regions of the world. And I think we have to think more broadly as to how you develop relationships. You mentioned a number of initiatives in the Commonwealth context about education and universities and research and culture, and all of that has to come in the mix. I'm afraid you cannot have an effective foreign policy on the cheap. You have to be ready to invest sufficiently. And there are some tools that continue to play in every country, and they will have to continue to be healthy in our own country too. Your diplomatic service is not a luxury. You need a solid system of representation through your embassies and offices. You need to make sure that these people have the resources to do something useful, and that they have the freedom to take initiatives and keep us on the map, keep us relevant, keep us engaged. We'll never advance our goals, and we will never protect our values unless we understand much better where the other side is coming from. And I can tell you from 8 years sitting in the UN Secretariat, where I didn't have a choice but trying to understand where all these countries from the South were coming from, I discovered that, seeing things through a Canadian prism was not necessarily the best way to understand, to respond adequately to the views, very different views and priorities of the rest of the world. So, bottom line, we will have to work harder if we want to maintain our seat at the table and be able to influence, at least to protect our interests and promote the kind of norms and values that we attach importance to.
Joe Clark, can I ask you to comment on that?
Sure. Thank you. One of Canada's strengths has been that we have worked through alliances, and they have been often alliances of like-minded. But what does like-minded mean in the world now? It could well mean a common view in identifying problems that need to be addressed. I think that simple habit, and to some degree the attitudes of the present government, have meant that we have not been reaching out to potential new allies. Who should our allies be in this world that Louise was talking about, where there are so many other countries that now have potentials that contest our own? They're not necessarily in a contestive relation with us, but as she said, we once had those fields to ourselves. Now we don't. Now there are other countries who may well be reluctant to have an association with the United States or with part of Europe or with China, but who could very well look to some kind of, call it a small a, not a capital A alliance, a very close working relation with Canada. One of the nations that strikes me as being very important in that category is Indonesia. It is a huge country, as we are. It's a diverse country, as we are. It's interested in democratic reform, as we are. And it has the largest Muslim population in the world, which is a highly critical factor in a time when so much of the conflict in the world is no longer caused by ideology, but is caused by culture and by religious differences and by those other sources of great potential combustion. Those need to be dealt with. That's a natural alliance for us. Where else are they? Where in Africa might they be? Where in Asia might they be? There's been a lot of talk, at least in corridors that I've been in, about ASEAN in the last few days here. That was a relationship that, for all of the funny dancing and funny singing we had to do, was of some very substantial advantage to us. It was a door into a region where there were not too many doors. And I think that I think the only part of the world where our reputation now is in serious jeopardy is in the Middle East. That is not a significant small part of the world, because the issue there radiates out to so much more of the world. The sense that we are so adamantly on one side that we will not consider enough the claims or perspectives of the other side. But elsewhere, by and large elsewhere, I don't think anything near fatal has happened to us yet. But we are drifting away from a strong position in a field where other countries, as Louise said, who weren't there are developing their strengths. We can't do this all on our own. They can't do this all on their own. There is an opportunity for some new contemporary alliances for Canada to be looking at that, among other things, will ensure that when issues arise that would contest the values that have infused institutions in the way Louise has described over the last 4 or 5 decades, we will be there not just with a seat, but with a reputation and a standing at the table where we can shape the next outcome.
Paul Heinbecker, can you comment on this as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a point that on something that Joe has just said, and that is I had a kind of track 2 effort involving 11 or 12 countries. It's Turkey, it's Korea, it's Indonesia, it's Brazil, South Africa, Germany sometimes, Japan. And the idea is that these are essentially G20 countries, but they're not the top tier G20, they're not the P5, but they're countries with some diplomatic capacity, with economic strength, and with an interest in what's going on. And we try to bring together think tanks, universities, policy planning staffs in a track 2 way to advance issues which would be of interest. You know, I guess it's in the Ronald Reagan sense that I say this, and that is, there's very little you can achieve if you don't mind who gets credit. Unfortunately, this body has spawned a ministerial level group that doesn't include Canada.
I'd like to just take up one of the comments that Louise made earlier, and that's whether Canada can maintain its position as a power that has some place at the table around a place like the G7. Can Canada take that for granted, and especially, and I'll put this to Rob, especially with the growing powers of countries in Asia that aren't represented in that body? What's the future for that?
Well, we certainly can't take it for granted, I don't think. And I think the reason we've had success in the past, I don't want to focus too much on the past because we should be looking forward, but the reason we've had success, in my view, and I don't have UN experience in New York, but I have lots of experience in Geneva, at the WTO, and at the GATT. The reason we were successful in molding, shaping, and advancing that institution and multilateral trade rules was because we brought ideas to the table. We invested heavily in a diplomatic service and an economic and trade policy service that had good ideas, that brought those ideas to the table, that got groups together who had common interests and were prepared, and we were prepared politically to fight for those ideas over the last 30 or 40 years. I think we've lost a little bit of that, I have to say, with the proliferation of bilateral and plurilateral agreements. It means the WTO has become less relevant. I think that's unfortunate. But there's still opportunities for us through these other means to bring good ideas to the table, to invest good people in these initiatives. If we do that, and if we bring the ideas to the table, and if we work hard at developing these associations and alliances, then I think we have a very bright future in terms of the role that we can play.
I want to echo that. I think you've put your finger on it. That's probably where Canada and a few other countries still have a definite advantage if we want to use it. It's in the realm of ideas. If you come to any multilateral organization with ideas, you're already several steps ahead of the rest. You shape it from the beginning. You frame the issue, and many of these countries that are rising up in the world, who will have a seat at the table, who will demand to be heard, are not yet at a stage where they are producers of a lot of ideas. And therefore, we have to protect that capacity. In fact, invest in it. It means investing really in our policy-making capacity. It means also investing in our capacity to anticipate and imagine the kind of challenges that lie out there in the future. From where I sit, I can see that at some point there will be a lot of challenges to Canada in relation to access to clean water, in relation to access to sources of energy, as some countries experience severe constraints domestically. And I can see the day where the pressure for some international norms will start increasing. Well, I think we would be well advised to ourselves start giving some serious thought and be ready when the moment comes to come in with something that will shape the international debate and perhaps influence the outcome. I don't know, I was not involved in climate change, but sometimes I wonder if we had invested sufficiently in designing an approach to the burden sharing that was more fairer towards our situation. Countries that produce energy, but vis-a-vis countries that consume energy, have different sets of challenges. The international regime that was built did not take that into account, and I don't recall that at any point we came in and said, we can't meet those goals, but here's something that could work and would be fair for everybody, and where we could be more of a player. That's where I think we need to be ready to invest and lead with ideas.
Thanks. I'm going to pause our discussion for a moment, and we'll turn to the audience and ask if we can take some questions from you. You'll have to bear with me with trying to figure out who put their hand up first. And I think we'll just start with taking 3 questions so the panelists can consider them, and we'll take those and then move on to the next. So I saw the woman in the toward the back in black, who I'm looking at now with glasses on her head. Yeah, that's you. You can just stand right up. Thanks. I know you were one of the first.
Yeah, thanks.
So go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Goldman. I'm a doctorate student here in the University of Ottawa. Thank you very much for the panel. My question has ties to with my own research interest, and I wonder if I could ask, how could we use immigration that was raised by Mr. Wright as one of the aspects of international affairs that we're dealing with, more as an instrument for reinforcing Canada's interest in international affairs. On a side note, looking at Ukrainian diaspora, that I think their organized representation was one of the drives of the strong stance that Canada took in the situation, regardless of what we think about it. How can we encourage, or is there room for encouraging such representation from all of the peoples who are stepping on this land to participate and reflect on their historical moments and societies that could help Canada advancing this influential role that we are trying to maintain or develop, basically. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we had a question from somebody toward the front wearing beige and with blonde hair, and she's standing up now.
So I'm a bit of a one-trick pony, so I'm going to interject into this conversation this notion that I raised yesterday around an urban agenda. Joe Clark talked about the importance of being asset-based and what we do well. And this question has been raised around, where does legitimacy come from? What does legitimacy look like? And I would like to suggest that legitimacy does not come from the size of your economy. I think that's an old idea. And that, in fact, legitimacy ought to come from the extent to which you embody as a nation those UN values, world peace, that are in fact, should be in fact, the objective of our international strategy. So my question is around all those things that we do well at the level of cities: adaptability, resilience, environmental impact, equity. We do a very good job, of course, of embodying difference, living side by side in our cities. We do that. We're world class at that. That's an idea and a value that we embody that we can export. And if we look at geopolitical instability, we know that that instability is a fight over values. And that's precisely something that we do so well. So I would like to put to the panel a question of how we, in fact, in our international strategy, can take those values that we embody so well and use this value-based approach to, in fact, reshape an entire approach to how we think about what we do in an international strategy, recognizing that the old rules are the old rules. We've already seen them disassemble. The way we think about international relations is something fundamentally different than it has been. How can we re-envision from that Canadian position of strength what it is that we do so well, how foreign relations move forward?
Thanks. And Errol Mendez at the front there.
First of all, thank you very much for the collective wisdom. What an amazing collection of wisdom here. I was in China in 2010 when they were doing the census, and they came up with the calculation of roughly 1.2, 1.3 billion, with a margin of error being between 26 and 35 billion, which is 35 million, which is our population. And you know that should give us a sense of the challenge we face. And Louise, to maybe talk about a different part of diplomacy, which nobody has talked about so far, is the ex-Worthian diplomacy, where he basically said, okay, fine, even though we are a middle big power, that we can still have a great impact on the world by creating coalitions of the willing. And we saw what happened with that. It led to the Landmines Treaty. It led to the responsibility to protect, the establishment of the International Criminal Court. And it ties in with what has just been said by another questioner, the ability to have not so much soft power, but moral authority. And my big concern is whether or not we are losing that moral authority for all the reasons that Paul and others said, where our sphere of moral authority is narrowing. So how do we get that back? How do we then recreate the ex-Worthian, and to show I'm non-partisan, the Mulroney-Clark ideas, which led to the fight against apartheid, and ultimately Paul Martin, which created perhaps in the international financial sphere the most important financial infrastructure, which is the G20. So how do we recreate that, given the fact that our moral authority is diminishing? How do we recreate that?
Okay, we're going to pause here. That's a lot to think about for the panelists. And I'm wondering, I'll just start us off, and I'll let all of you feel free to jump in where you like on these questions. Just to start off with the first around the question of immigration and the diaspora, the role that diasporas can play. And I think I'll put that to Rob, if that's okay, because you mentioned the importance of immigration. And we'll have everyone else feel free to jump in, and also bearing in mind we're getting toward the end of our time here. We've got about 10 minutes left, so we'll see if we can get to other questions, and I apologize if I miss some of you. I probably will.
So I'll be short. I think global movement of people is becoming a crucial issue. I think we need to understand it better. I think we have to look at it in the context of the growing, or the disparity in wealth growth in different parts of the world, and the fact that a lot of the world wants to move to areas of greater opportunity. I think you talk about China, 20 million people a year in China move from rural districts into the cities. That's an internal migration, but nevertheless an incredible trend that I think we have to understand better in terms of where it's driving China and what the implications for Canada will be. We've talked, and I see a rising resistance in Western countries generally, slow growth Western countries, to increased immigration. You certainly see this in Western Europe. You see it, of course, on CNN every day in the United States. And I sense that even in Canada, a country founded on immigration policies, I sense a greater degree of reluctance to look at large number of immigrants, which we will need, in fact, to help continue to grow our economy. So it does worry me a little bit. On the question of why this is important to Canada, not just economic reasons, I think the diaspora that you referred to, 1.25, as I mentioned earlier, Chinese Canadians in Canada now. We've talked for years within government about how we can use these communities better to understand and pursue our interests. I think that's something that the government still needs to invest in and understand better than we do at the moment. We're not doing an adequate job, even at the universities, where we have large populations of immigrant students. I don't think many universities follow up very well on where their graduates go, whether they go back to their home countries, and if so, how we can build on those relationships to advance Canadian interests, not just commercially, but also in terms of exerting our influence in the regions.
May I say something on that, and also touch on the trick pony for just a second? And on the question of urban areas, I've talked about the characteristic that flows from people working together in terms of a tradition of diversity. Paul Evans of UBC uses what's perhaps a better phrase. He talks about cosmopolitanism, which is more specifically urban. And it is a great value and asset to Canada. My worry, I have a great worry about an aspect of Canadian diasporas who live here from elsewhere. I think for a long, long time, largely out of an abundance of caution, we were not very helpful in indicating to newcomers to Canada what it was they were joining. And I think that that for quite a while had an impact upon their willingness and ability to play the active role that is now being played by more and more of them. There's another factor. When people come new to a country, they are going to put their focus upon their own internal adjustment in their new society. They're going to worry more about their kids and their schools than they are about their communities and their governance. What has happened recently is that there has been a very vigorous determination to involve some diaspora communities in international policy. But through the lens of shaping Canadian policy to address some of those particular communities. That's a very seductive approach for governments to follow, particularly for political leaders to follow. It's also very dangerous, I think, because it runs the risk of moving against the question of integration of people from various sources into a whole, and it can feed senses of anti-immigration in our country as elsewhere. So I think one of the domestic issues we have to face is to take a look at these growing numbers of new Canadians and ensure that they are participating in a broad menu of means of access to forming international policy. I can remember a time when, I think you'd correct me, those of you who were in foreign affairs longer than I was, but my impression was that there was a period in which if there was someone who was a Chinese Canadian, they were not likely to be posted to China because there was some concern that they were. So we had a sort of an act of discrimination against using what should be an asset now. I think to some degree elements of that suspicion persist in our society, and we have to find some way to deal with it. The final word. In cities, people don't have much choice about working with their neighbors. They're all together. We're a huge country, and the possibility of people retreating into silos is always present in Canada. It is not insignificant that the Charter of Values, so-called, in Quebec, rose principally in rural areas of that province. And I think that we have to be much more attentive to ways in which we can build a sense of Canadian community, conversations with people that will integrate them into the country, including, and perhaps even specifically, on international issues, where they have unique advantages to bring. Each of them does because of their connection to their cultures of origin.
Louise, do you want to address these?
I'd like to address the comment made by Errol Mendez. I must say I wince a little when you talk about moral authority, because I think there's a very fine line between moral authority and moral superiority, and a feeling of moral superiority. And this will be less and less appreciated in the future. I think, in fact, what allowed us to form these coalitions and to get results is, surely the cause was right, but I think it was we were perceived as a country that was fairly impartial in how it dealt with these issues. It was really sensitive to the concerns of all the ones we wanted to convince, and we were solution-oriented. And that has been the hallmark, I think, of Canadian diplomacy in international institutions, as well as in bilateral relations, is this capacity to invent compromise, because you always have to find a compromise, a position that's acceptable to the vast majority. That has been our strength. So I'd rather not put too much emphasis on the moral leadership, even though there are moral choices that we made in the kind of causes we pursue. But remember that the reason why we were successful is not because we had the right cause, but we went at finding solutions to these problems, challenges, causes in a way that was able to rally a lot of people. That requires sensitivity, and it requires a lot of patience. We shouldn't lose that.
Thanks very much. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time, so...
One last comment, and that is that it took until the last 5 minutes before the United States was mentioned. I can't remember any time in the past when a discussion of Canadian foreign policy wouldn't have actually begun with the United States. And maybe it's a sign of the times and the difficulty of relations that exist, but they still are number one, folks, and they're going to stay that way militarily for a very long time to come. They have 11 times as many battle groups, aircraft carriers than the Chinese have, for example. So it's an extremely important relationship to us in almost every respect. And I think what we really probably ought to be worrying about most, particularly if the tendency we start to drift towards a world of power and not a world of laws, is that all of that talk about relations with China and relations with everybody else is going to go out the window, and relations with Washington are going to become even more important for us, because that's going to be where our bread is buttered. So I think, to end this point, I think it's, while they're going through some very difficult times with tea parties in Congress and all of that, it is nevertheless the country that we have to get along with best. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this. This was an excellent opportunity to hear from all of you. We have a break now, and I'll just apologize for the questions we didn't get to. I'm sorry about that. We'll take a break, and I think we'll reconvene at 11 o'clock. Thanks.